for talking too loud, so I'm not going to use this.
Okay. Welcome to the program. This is our 4th annual Juneteenth event, which was for about as long as Juneteenth has been in existence, officially. So it's a great program that we do every year, and this year we have 3 guest speakers, and the past few years we have 2. And we try to rotate the speakers and make it a little bit more interesting each year and more local. Those are our goals. Before I get started with Juneteenth, I'd like to announce our next event, July 8th, and I'll be sending out information about this program. Drew Marshall, can you stand up? Really great community person, really interested in educating the public, and he does programs on the Arabic language and Middle Eastern culture. So we are going to try to have a few presentations by him on different topics to try to give you an understanding of what the actual culture is like. And we'll start with 2 presentations, one on July 8th, the second one on July 22nd, and that'll be at our Lambourne Library location, 7 o'clock to 8:30. I'll get these copied off and forwarded to you also. And depending on how those go, we'll have more in the future. Thank you so much, Drew. Thank you to all of our volunteers from the Historical Society. It's great when people step up and say, how can I help out? So we have Gage over in the corner, manning the camcorder. We have the Pettigills. We have Will and Ryan in the back. One of you is already standing. Hey, hold up your hand. Yeah, great guys, and they always ask how they can help out the community. So I challenge all of you to step up a little bit and do something for your community. It doesn't have to be anything historically related. It doesn't have to be the fire company, but everybody is begging for volunteers. So wherever you can help out, please do. So this event, we have 3 guest speakers. Darlene is going to introduce each one of them separately. She is our vice president. First, I'd like to thank everybody who made this possible. Newcastle County steps up every year and gives us a grant, and it's a pretty substantial amount that allows us to do this program. So we thank Newcastle County for the grant. We also thank Matt Myers and his office for supporting us, and every year he delivers a proclamation. So we're expecting one this year, and we're waiting for his representative to come through. He was busy with another event tonight. It's a busy evening for a lot of people. The fire company, great group, and they're struggling with volunteers also. So anything you can do to support them, especially send in your donations. They mail out a donation, a request for a donation every year at least once. And please fill that out and give them $100 per household would be nice. That offsets the cost of you for taxes. Let's see. And we have a few other volunteers that aren't here tonight, I believe, so I won't mention them. Hey, you know, if they're not going to show up, we'll let them slide on that. So we think that you'll really enjoy the program tonight, and I do get yelled at by Darlene for going on too long. So I will let the program begin. Oh, there's Darlene. She was hiding behind me, making faces after.
Yeah, that's Pete. My name is Darlene Amobi. I'm Vice President at Hockessin Historical Society, and I'm very happy that you all were able to join us tonight. And what I want to do is just introduce our speakers. I'm going to start off with our first speaker standing right over here. Her name is Laura Engelhardt, and she has a wonderful discussion, a wonderful lecture on some residents of Hockessin. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to without further ado, I'm going to let Laura start. Laura.
Thank you. Well, before I go to the microphone, I just want to ask if anybody here knows who Mary Ann Chad Carey is. You Just okay. Well, we're here because of Juneteenth. We're celebrating Juneteenth. And Mary Ann Shadd was a free black born in 1823. So what does she know about Juneteenth? She and her family worked for the abolition of slavery their whole lives. So that's their contribution to Juneteenth. And I'm going to talk about Mary Ann Shadd and her family, and I just want you to keep this in mind, that she was born 2 years after Harriet Tubman. And I know you all know Harriet Tubman's story and her upbringing, where she was born and how she escaped Canada. I know you all know that. So think that at the same time that was happening, Mary Ann Shadd Carey, not living in Maryland, she was living in Wilmington. She was born in Wilmington, Delaware, and she had a very different life. So this is Mary Ann, and this is the only known photograph of her. I'm hoping that with the digitizing of records, we might find another photo, because she was involved in so many things. She was an abolitionist, she was a teacher, she was a suffragist, a writer, teacher, one of the country's first female lawyers. She did so much. There must be a picture of her, even if it's in a group setting. So we'll try to find another picture of her. So she was born in 1823, and she was described as being quite beautiful and tall, slim, and having that ravishing, dream-born quality, that twilight of the races that we call mulatto. And for her part, Mary Ann did not like to talk about race. She just liked to think of people as having different complexions, but we're all the same. And this might be because of her background and her family beginnings. The first Shadd in this country was Hans Shadd, and he was a Hessian mercenary, and he was in General Braddock's army in the French and Indian War, and he was wounded in 1756, and he was sent to a home in Chadds Ford that was owned by Elizabeth Jackson, and her daughter, also named Elizabeth, lived there. And the young soldier and the young Elizabeth fell in love and married, and they had 2 children, Hans Jr. and Jeremiah. And they moved to Mill Creek 100. So that's the tie-in to this area. And I don't know why they moved to Mill Creek 100, but perhaps there was a relative on the Jackson side. So they were here, and Hans was a butcher in Wilmington. And Elizabeth was known as Aunt Betty, and she had a tea shop, and it was just, her tea shop was elite, and it was the perfect place to go for a cup of tea and to spend some time with friends. And they had children, and Jeremiah was a butcher and then also a shoemaker. And then Abraham, who was Mary Ann's father, also was a shoemaker. And so he was born in Wilmington, and he was a leader in the free black community. They would meet, free blacks would meet and talk about what they could do to improve their lot. And they always had in mind that to improve the blacks or the free blacks would benefit everyone. I put some images on this particular slide just so that we can keep everything about Abraham together. The Canadian government issued a stamp honoring him in 2008. You see that on the right. And in the middle is Jeremiah's tombstone, which is in Canada. And we'll get to the Canada part of this story in a while. But what
I love about this is the tombstone says, born Wilmington, Delaware. And he died in 1882, and he never forgot where he came from. He never forgot Wilmington, Delaware. So, Abraham, as I said, was a leader in the Wilmington community. He represented Delaware at conventions of free people of color. And he was actually the president the third year that he went. And this is an actual sketch of one of the conventions. An 1820 census estimated there were 6.2% slaves in Delaware and free blacks 17.8%. And as you can kind of logically imagine, most of the slaves were in Sussex County, and then fewer in Kent, and very few in Newcastle County. But free blacks had a very interesting problem. They didn't have masters protecting them, taking care of them. And they had some challenges that they were going to the market, or they were going, just walking around, because they couldn't prove that they were free. And so there were meetings about what can we do, what can free blacks do? Are there some solutions that might be good for them? And Abraham was on committees to discuss this. And one of the thoughts was to have for the free blacks to go to either the Caribbean or to go to Africa. And they actually worked out an agreement with the owner of some land in West Africa, and they called it Liberia, and this is a place where blacks could go. Liberia, it's connected to the word liberty. Their capital, and still is, their capital is Monrovia, and that was in honor of President Monroe, who was the president at the time. Their currency was the dollar bill. It still is. So there was that tie. But Abraham said, even though we recognize our roots and where we came from, and we give all honor to Africa, that's not who we are. We're American, and we're not moving. We're not staying. Black codes came into being, and this was, again, there was not like a book you would buy that said black codes, and then there were codes that were listed. It was just a general feeling of way to treat free blacks. So they couldn't, no more than 5 could meet without a white person being present. And they could only hold certain jobs. Like you could not, if you were black, you could not apply for a government job, or you couldn't, and not in any way be a postal worker or certainly a lawyer or a doctor. And so they were really, really constrained. And Abraham was frustrated with this. Also, there was no education for black children. At the time, they had the sales of slaves, the profit from the sale of slaves went to the education for white children, because there wasn't much education in place for white children. I mentioned Harriet Tubman earlier. Abraham was a close friend and co-worker of Thomas Garrett on the Underground Railroad. So Mary Ann grew up listening to her father and her mother talk about the rights of people in her home, and this stayed with her whole life. And so Abraham was integral on the Underground Railroad, but then he wanted education for his children. And there were many Quakers in Westchester, nearby Westchester, where he thought his children had a better chance. Mary Ann was the first of 13 children. And I'll say at this point that it amazes me that we don't have any Shads in the community, because Abraham was one of 12, Mary Ann was one of 13. Where did they go? Conditions were not favorable for them in Delaware, so they moved. So Abraham moved his family to Westchester in 1833 when Mary Ann was 10. And finally, well, here's a picture of a shoemaker. This is one of the trades that were accepted for free blacks. So in Westchester, Mary Ann had a Quaker teacher whose name was Hannah Darlington, and Phoebe Darlington, and Phoebe taught her the basic education components that all Quaker children had, which was mathematics, English, mechanical arts, as well as sharing with her the beliefs, the tenets of Quakerism. So Mary Ann already had these ideas coming from her parents about how to treat other people and to push yourself and to rely on yourself. And now she was getting that from this Quaker teacher and some other thoughts. So talking about the Underground Railroad, this is a National Geographic picture of the Underground Railroad. And I don't know if you're like me, but I grew up thinking, since I was in Delaware, I thought that there was only one route for the Underground Railroad, that it was up the East Coast, straight north. Well, you can see there were many ways, and some to reach freedom, and even some escaped people, enslaved people, went south and went to Texas or Florida. But what I find interesting is the Shads had a connection with people in Canada, and the western part of Canada, right above Detroit. It's called Canada. It was then called Canada West. Now it's Ontario. Fugitive Slave Act of 1870. Things were getting a little bit even more tense. This is a bridge. This is the Detroit River. And the left side is Detroit, the right side is Canada. So that is the distance that freedom seekers had to cross, had to go to be free. And it is about 3 to 5 miles, this distance between Detroit and Windsor. And I kind of think that maybe the Shads wanted to be free. They wanted to be away from the United States, but they wanted to be close to it. They wanted to be close to their homeland. And in fact, what many people don't know is that the freedom seekers didn't get free and they were just left to their own devices, and that they were, in a wilderness. There were already communities established there to welcome them. And Canada had abolished slavery many years earlier, and there were already communities of former American residents that were in Canada to welcome them. So the Canada Gears. This is a picture of one of the houses in a place called the Dawn Settlement. So this is one of those communities that were established. And Mary Ann immediately started teaching, because once she got out of finished her Quaker education, she started teaching. So that was her first occupation, and also writing. And she wrote her thoughts from a very early age. She wrote notes of Canada West because the American government was discouraging people from immigrating to Canada. They were telling them all kinds of horrible things. You don't want to go to Canada. So she set the record straight, and she wrote, this is information of colored immigrants. And she said the soil was good, it was very peaceful, temperate climate. And she also, at this point, started a newspaper for free blacks. And the intent was to give them information about what was happening in the community and also give them advice. And with this undertaking, she became the first black female editor of a newspaper on the North American continent, because that included Canada and the United States. So she did this. She really had a lot of guts. And the masthead said, self-reliance is the true road to independence. So she had, one of the ways that she differed from another newspaper in that area and another prominent black leader was that she said, we can do this on our own. We don't need people to do this for us. And the Reverend Bob said, no, we need the white people to show us the way. While she was living there, John Brown paid a visit. John Brown was looking for backing, looking for money to fund his raid on Harper's Ferry. And a lot of the people that were living in Canada West were wealthy. They were business people. And he thought he could get some money there. I don't know the answer. I don't know if he was successful or not. But Mary Ann wanted to cover this event in her paper. And she wanted to go. But no, she didn't get to go, but Osborne Anderson, who was originally from Westchester, went to observe the raid on Harper's Ferry, and he was one of the few survivors. So Mary Ann married a barber. His name was Thomas Carey, and they had 2 children, Sarah Elizabeth in 1857. And then there was a downturn in the economy. Even though the subscription to the Provincial Freedman was very little, people still couldn't afford it. So the paper closed, and then in 1864, Mary Ann became a recruiting officer for black soldiers for the Union Army. And she did a wonderful job, and this is a photograph of her brother Abraham W. Shadd, who was a Union soldier. At the end of the Civil War, Mary's husband had died, the paper had folded, and many newly freed blacks were going to Washington, D.C., settling there. They needed teachers, so Mary Ann went to Washington, D.C. to fill a need. This is a picture of a school where she was principal. This is the John F. Cook School. And she also, during this time, she was still writing for newspapers, giving her thoughts. She did that all the time. Throughout her life, she was sharing her thoughts. There was no black or there was no gray area for Mary Ann. It was either black or white. And she was very firm. She was a little bit bossy, I think, and very firm in her convictions. So in 1869, she enrolled in Howard Law School's first class. She was the only woman in a class of 21 students. And she gave a presentation on tax law, of all things. But she did very well in her studies, but it took her a long time to finally get her license to practice law. And there are several reasons for this. I think the school closed for lack of funds for a period of time. Mary Ann was teaching, or she was a principal, all day long. She had 2 children, and maybe she took a class at a time. But anyway, she was finally successful in receiving her law degree and practiced law the last 10 years of her life. This is an etching of Charlotte Ray, who was in the 2nd class at Howard Law, and she graduated in 1872. Another endeavor that Mary Ann followed was the right to vote. So suffrage, women's suffrage was on the front burner at this time. Mary Ann went to all the women's suffrage meetings and then reported back to the black community on the progress and what was going on. But she started something in 1880 called the Colored Women's Progressive Franchise Association. So this is not a picture, this is a picture of that group, but it's not when Mary Ann was there. It's a little later. But this is a document of the constitution of the women's National Women's Suffrage Association, and Mary Ann is listed at the bottom. Resident Congressional Committee, Mary Shad Carey, Washington, D.C. Mary Ann died of cancer at age 70 in 1893. And she was praised at the service, and the minister who spoke said that she had spent her life doing for others, and this is a quote from his eulogy: her energy and perseverance, as well as her ability to suffer in the causes she espoused, entitled her to rank among the reformers of the time. She left to others to carry forward the torch she had ignited. So Mary Ann Shad Carey, teacher, abolitionist, reformer, journalist, editor, orator, lawyer, wife, and mother, was finally laid to rest, and she well deserved her motto of self-reliance is the true road to freedom. Am I getting close? Oh, let me wrap up. She's buried outside of Washington, D.C. And then I just wanted to just quickly show you some honors that have been bestowed upon her in Canada. This is Canada, plaque to Mary Ann, and also one for the Provincial Freedmen. Her last home in Washington, D.C. is on the National Register of Historic Places. And this is, as I said, Washington, D.C. You can't tour it, but you can see it, and there's a plaque on the fence. In 1997, she was inducted into the Delaware Women's Hall of Fame. And these are descendants that came to the ceremony. They came from Canada, Washington, D.C., Detroit, Denver, cousins meeting for the first time. It was thrilling. And then the following year, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, New York. Again, descendants came for the ceremony. The following year, two of the Canadians brought a painting. They commissioned a painting of Mary Ann and presented it to the city of Wilmington. And there's Mayor Sills and Mayor Baker. It was during the transition time. And this is a photograph. This is a portrait that the Afro-American Historical Society that's at Howard High School commissioned. And when the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened in 2016, there was a display dedicated to Mary Ann Shad Carey. Post Office, Wilmington Post Office was named after her. And there's the Congress people, and her descendants are on the right. Then in February of 2020, a historic marker was dedicated in downtown. It's at the top of Peter Spencer Plaza, right behind at the back side of the Grand Opera House. And again, descendants came. A statue dedicated in her honor at the University of Windsor. And then a stamp from the Canadian government was issued in February of this year, 2024. I have some suggested reading that I can show you later, share with you. And coming soon, my book. I have a book coming out. It's at the Designer, and so it's written, and that's the cover, and so it should be out soon, I hope. All right, thank you. And I guess
later, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Laura. That was really good. I learned a lot. And now we have CJ Bell. He is going to do a resolution. CJ?
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? All right, awesome. So County Exec couldn't make it today. He did want to express his regards, and I wanted to just make sure I thank Ms. Darlene and Pete as well, and just the whole team at Hockessin Historical Society for your constant recognition of such an important day. This is a holiday for us at the county. We were off. This is a holiday that we want to continue, of course, recognizing. So I want to read a little bit of this proclamation for you all, and then I'll present it to the leadership team here tonight. So, June 19, 2024, whereas President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, declaring that all enslaved people be freed, and whereas on June 19, 1865, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Union soldiers traveled to Galveston, Texas, where the last enslaved African Americans lived, and shared the delayed news that the Civil War had ended and that those enslaved were free. And whereas Juneteenth commemorates the emancipation of the last enslaved African Americans in the United States and is a yearly celebration of freedom in African American culture, and now, therefore, Matthew Meyer, County Executive of Newcastle County, by virtue of the authority vested in himself, do hereby proclaim June 19, 2024 as Juneteenth in Newcastle County in honor of Shirley Bullitt and her family. I commend the Hockessin Historical Society for coordinating an informative Juneteenth event to educate county residents on the holiday history and continued importance in today's world. Thank you.
We're going to get ready for Wade Katz now. He's the archaeologist that's going to talk to us a little bit, and it's going to take us just a couple more minutes, and then he'll be ready. Thank you.
And in the meantime, if you need to use the restroom, they're right over here, halfway down the room. And if you'd like a drink, we have flavored sparkling water in the back, and also plain water. So feel free to help yourself.
I think that'll work. My technical changes have happened, so I'm in good shape. I want to thank you for asking me to speak tonight on this momentous occasion in American history. For my presentation tonight, I'd like to take a look at some of the recent stories that are being revealed through the in-depth historical and archaeological research that's being done in a number of different places in the American Revolution. And so I'm going to ask you to you're going to go on perhaps a whirlwind journey. I hope it doesn't turn out that way, but it's going to be something of a journey that we follow individuals kind of through Newcastle County into some other areas of the U.S. I hope to elevate, illuminate, and amplify the actions of Black Americans, free and enslaved, as they navigated the war years of the American Revolution, and in some cases into the current period of time, our days today. These are stories that are known by some people, have been known for a long time. Others are known but have been forgotten, and others are coming to light through this new research. And in at least one of the cases here, you'll see there was a deliberate attempt to erase some of this story, which is now being kind of resurrected and recreated. So whether by choice or by force, a lot of African Americans on the Delmarva Peninsula and in the wider Mid-Atlantic region were caught up in the disruption chaos of the American Revolution over that 8-year period. And I'll start some of this with the British invasion of 1777. Now, I'd like to be able to put us right into Mill Creek 100. I'm probably not going to do that for you tonight, so we'll kind of move around Mill Creek 100, but we'll get close. So to start, is that your big arrow?
Yes.
I want to introduce you to Captain Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. Some of you may be familiar with this individual. He is the grandfather of a later very well-known American rebel, Robert E. Lee. Captain Lee, in the winter of 1778, was sent down on a foraging expedition into Newcastle County from Valley Forge. Washington's army is sitting at Valley Forge. They need horses, they need food, they need forage, they need livestock, they need to live at Valley Forge. We are fortunate because there's an account book that exists of one of Lee's captains and the information that they gathered as they went. Now, Lee's foraging expedition was vital to the American Army as it was wintering at Valley Forge. Washington's forces were literally starving, and Lee's foraging gathered important foodstuffs and livestock to keep the Continental Army alive. Lee needed teamsters to do this work, and his small detachment of dragoons, he's a cavalry officer, he's a dragoon officer, that unit was not big enough to supply the wagon drivers or the wagons, and so he was authorized to impress those people, horses and wagons that he needed. The list you see here is housed, the original is housed at the Gloucester County Historical Society in Woodbury, New Jersey. And this list records the names of the wagon drivers, the numbers of wagons, the horses, the oxen, and all of the items that were impressed by the American Army to gather those supplies. 21 wagons, 80 horses, 2 oxen were impressed from Newcastle County, from landowners in White Clay Creek, Pencader, Red Lion, Newcastle, and St. George's Hundreds. 2 of those also came from Cecil County, Maryland. Of those 21 teamsters needed to drive those wagons, 6 were African Americans. Identified by first name only, an indication that these men were likely enslaved. Joseph, Harry, Jack, David, Cuff, and Samuel. The enslavers are identified too, since the humans, wagons, livestock were owned 1777 by these people. John Loudon, you may recognize some of these names if you're doing historical research in Newcastle County. John Loudon, Valentine Duchesne, Captain Witherspoon of Middletown, Delaware, John Rollins, and Sidney George. Among those black drivers also was one man named Samuel, who, as you can see here highlighted, was enslaved by Thomas Gooch at Gooch's Bridge. We know very little about Samuel or whether he wanted to undertake this job. Ironically, he's an enslaved man driving an impressed wagon to gather supplies for an army fighting for liberty. You can kind of look at the confusion and complexity of that entire statement. Our Samuel of 1778 may be the same Samuel who, 24 years earlier in 1774, took the opportunity to seek his freedom from the miller Thomas Gooch. Samuel in 1754 was 50 years old, tall and with hair already graying. By 1778, he would have been in his mid-70s. We also know that Sam was still enslaved at Gooch House in 1780, when Colonel Thomas Gooch prepared his will. But beyond these few scant records, we know next to nothing about Samuel. While seemingly mundane and trivial, therefore, this list of wagoners is an extremely useful document. We have never seen that kind of information before about Samuel or any of those other individuals on that list. And it helps us to be able to piece together the lost life stories of these individuals. There were other enslaved persons at Gooch's Bridge as well during the colonial period and into the early national period. Some of their names are recorded in official records like wills and administrations. You see some of the individuals listed here: Hatfield, Bristol, Caesar, Tony, Jemima, Maria, Blank and Davy were all early members, enslaved people at the Cooch property. And as an aside, that Cooch property is now state-owned land. A new historic site is being developed there, and these stories will be told at that site. There's another enslaved man in 1777 at Cooch's Bridge at the time of the battle. He's not a Delawarean at all, but instead he came from North Carolina, almost 400 miles away. His name was Benjamin Harris Martin. To learn about him, it was necessary to find out about his enslaver, Alexander Martin. Alexander Martin was born in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, and was educated at the Francis Allison Academy in Chester County. Those of you who know the history of the University of Delaware know that the Francis Allison Academy is the forerunner to the University of Delaware. After that, he was educated at West Nottingham Academy in Maryland, and then received his college education at Princeton. After graduation, Alexander Martin relocated to North Carolina and practiced law. When the war came, he was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the North Carolina Continental Line. The North Carolina Brigade marched north in 1777 to join Washington's army as it fought to protect the new nation's capital at Philadelphia. In late August, after the Crown forces had landed on Elk Neck in Maryland, Colonel Martin was selected to serve in an American Light Infantry Corps and as part of that advanced force that fought at Cooch's Bridge. Martin fought at Cooch's Bridge, Brandywine, and at the Battle of the Clouds before the Light Corps was disbanded. He also fought at Germantown, but in the wake of that American defeat, he was court-martialed and resigned his commission. He returned to North Carolina and served multiple terms as governor, as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and as a senator. Alexander Martin prepared his will in 1807. He was a prominent white man in a slave state, and his plantation, called Danbury in Rockingham County, included 62 enslaved people. He seems to have recognized the inconsistencies of the institution of slavery and what the goals of the War of Independence had intended to do. Wrestling with the hypocrisy of slavery in a free land, and in North Carolina, which was a land built on the agricultural or plantation-based economy, Alexander Martin willed some of his enslaved people to others, standard practice in that period of time, but he attempted to keep family groups together. Two men, however, Martin singled out from his dozens of enslaved blacks. One man, Prince, had served Governor Martin as his confidant and carriage driver, and he was granted his freedom in the will. The second man was Benjamin Harris Martin. The enslaved Benjamin Harris Martin had been willed to Alexander Martin in 1777 by his uncle, by Alexander Martin's uncle. The two men, Alexander and Benjamin, went to war together, marching the hundreds of miles northward to the Delaware Valley as part of the North Carolina Brigade. But Benjamin Harris Martin was more than an enslaved black man serving his white officer. Alexander Martin makes clear in his will that Benjamin was much, much more. As Alexander recorded in his 1807 will, quote, "As for my man Ben, his services entitled him to this favor of freedom. When his public services are considered, they must be deemed highly meritorious by his country. It is well known, and I hereby certify, that he served his country 3 years in the Continental Service under my command faithfully and with the reputation as a soldier, and poor fellow being as a humble friend, companion, and servant." Alexander Martin continued in his will that Benjamin, quote, "bravely risked his life to obtain from British domination for his master and country a liberty that he was incapable of enjoying the benefits of." Not only did the former governor award Benjamin his freedom, he made sure that Benjamin's family, his wife, Sarah, his children, Ambrose, Charles, Swanee, Lucy, and Sarah's children, Jesse and Micajah, were all free. And he willed the family 440 acres of land in North Carolina, livestock, and farming tools, essentially setting up Benjamin Harris Martin as a free landowner. So Benjamin Harris Martin had gone to war with Colonel Alexander, and he was a soldier. Based on the description provided by Alexander, Benjamin certainly carried a weapon. fighting for liberty. That means that Benjamin Harris Martin, an enslaved man from North Carolina, fought for the American cause as part of the Light Infantry Corps at Couch's Bridge, and at Brandywine, and at the Battle of the Clouds, and at Germantown. But unlike many of his fellow white soldiers, Benjamin Harris Martin's war record is not documented in the muster rolls, pension records, or other official papers. We only know of his service because Alexander Martin confirmed it in his will. Finding small clues like this is what careful, detailed historical research is all about. As my colleague Scott Stevenson at the Museum of the American Revolution has stated, accurate history is inclusive history. It took 40 years for Alexander Martin to do something in a slave state to acknowledge Benjamin's sacrifices. This is another one of those lost historical sources that sheds light on the revolutionary generation, white and black, and the unfinished nature of the war. How to deal with the messiness, inconsistencies, and complicated legacy of slavery. Now I'm going to come back to the Delaware River Valley in the fall of 1777. At this time, the British Army has captured the new capital at Philadelphia, and in late September, but that seizure did not end the war, nor did it bring needed supplies to the British Army, who are now stuck essentially in Philadelphia. They need the Delaware River to be open. The Royal Navy had the supplies, but the river was still defended by Forts Mifflin and Mercer, also known as Red Bank, the river obstructions, and a small but powerful Pennsylvania Navy. It would take another 2 months for the Royal Navy to cut its way through the obstructions and overcome the forts and the rebel navy. On the New Jersey side of the Delaware, opposite Fort Mifflin, which is approximately where the Philadelphia International Airport is today, stood an earthen fort called Fort Mercer, or Red Bank. This fort was manned by the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments, commanded by Colonel Christopher Green and Colonel Israel Angel. These two regiments came to the fort in the middle of October 1777 in time to be part of one of the most important American victories in the American Revolution. The Rhode Island regiments of 1777 were integrated formations containing black and Native American soldiers from the New England colonies. And if you're familiar with the Rhode Island Regiment of 1781, this is a very different structure. That regiment had 2 segregated companies that were African American companies. The regiments that you see here fighting at Red Bank were integrated regiments. They were not segregated out in companies. All the men were in the regiment together. Recent historical scholarship by my colleague Robert Selig and also by my colleague Dr. Jen Janowski has definitely identified nearly 50 of the men defending Red Bank as men of color, or about 10% of the garrison. This force inflicted a horrific defeat on the Hessian soldiers who assaulted the force on the 22nd of October 1777. Nearly 25% of the assault force were casualties, while the defenders suffered only 14 killed and 21 wounded. Until very recently, though, and again through the research of my colleague Jen Janowski, absent from most historical narratives is the story of African Americans and Native Americans who fought in this battle. Shamefully, almost since the guns fell silent, the historical record at Red Bank has been distorted, and black participation at times has been erased from the historical narrative by some white authors. The importance of the Battle of Red Bank has long been recognized by African American scholars and historians, but the dominant white published narrative often drowned out their writings. In 1831, for example, James Forten, prominent African American activist in Philadelphia, wrote of his eyewitness account seeing the New England regiments in 1777 march through the city under Colonel Christopher Green on their way to Red Bank. Forten notes that these black troops were some of the brave men as ever fought, but that the black participation at the defense of Red Bank, quote, seems forgotten now in 1831. One of the first black authors to write about African Americans in the Revolution was a man named William Nell in his book, The Colored Patriots in the American Revolution, published in 1855. Nell, like Forten, tried to get readers to recognize the importance of the role of African Americans played at Red Bank. But he noted that public memory of their participation is failing. Quote, yet who now hears them spoken of in connection with it? End quote. Ironically, the American Civil War should have been a time to elevate the participation of African Americans, particularly Northern blacks, in the creation of the country. Black abolitionist Alfred Green offered an impassioned argument for their enlistment in April of 1861, stating, "These colored soldiers should be attached to the home guard. They will make Herculean defenders. Colored men, it should be remembered, fought the glorious Battle of Red Bank when the city was in peril in 1777. That was published in 1862. But sadly, some white communities were threatened by even the mention of black patriots or their role in the revolution at Red Bank. In a Harrisburg newspaper in August of 1862, there was a call for the recruitment of African Americans. In response, the local paper ran a story stating that the recruiting statement was, quote, evidently a burlesque, a hoax, a sell, end quote, at the expense of Harrisburg's African American community. It went on to state that arguments in favor of recruiting blacks based on their heroics at Red Bank are, quote, monstrous assertions, end quote. He continued, that anonymous author, it would not be very complimentary to the Hessians who reside in Harrisburg to say that their ancestors were whipped at Red Bank by African Americans, even if there was any truth in the assertion, but there is not, which is a blatant lie. But I'm editorial. The placement of a monument in 1906 to commemorate the victory at Red Bank and the soldiers who defended the fort did not include any reference to the fort's African American defenders, despite the editorial statements and the editors and statements in African American newspapers. Eugene Gregory, one of those editorialists, even sent his copy to the governor of New Jersey, quote, lest the fact that Negro soldiers fought in the battle escape your attention, end quote. He also wrote, this occasion would give opportunity for some tribute to black participants in the battle. The colored citizens of this state, I am sure, would appreciate any complimentary reference which you may make. He also likened Colonel Christopher Green, the commanding officer of the fort, referencing him as the Robert Gould Shaw of the American Revolution, a comparison that surely his contemporary white readers would recognize as the gallant commander of the 54th Massachusetts during the Civil War. He went on to say the impressive dedication of the battle monument in New Jersey gives opportunity to the nation to pause for a moment and consider whether the services rendered by the Negro who in time of vital importance assisted in wrenching the colonies free from the grasp of England have aroused a lasting gratitude and a sympathetic treatment. The 1906 monument was an opportunity to address a historical wrong. Nothing came of Gregory's entreaties, and the monument, as erected, includes no reference to the role of African Americans in the fight. With the monument's dedication, black participation had been erased from the historical landscape. The early 20th century witnessed a level of racism in American history that sought to diminish the role of African Americans and to solidify their role as second-class citizens. At Red Bank, this removal of their pivotal role in the battle was perhaps most manifest in the unofficial guidebook of the Red Bank Battlefield Park, which it is today a county park. It was commissioned by the county freeholders. The book was written in 1927 by local historian and battle authority Frank Stewart, and he explained the supposed misinformation about blacks at the battle at Red Bank by claiming that, quote, the swarthy complexions, end quote, of the French participants in the battle gave origin to the report that there were some Negroes under Colonel Green, end quote. Stewart's historical gymnastics describing French officers as swarthy set the tone for almost a century of exclusionary interpretation of the park. I'm happy to say that that has been changed. As I mentioned earlier, my colleague Jen Janowski has been working very strenuously on this to get that story changed and corrected with interpretive panels and writings that she's doing. And in 2012, the New Jersey Historical Commission, 2019, the New Jersey Historical Commission awarded a research grant to Red Bank Battlefield Park to explore the role of black soldiers that take place in the battle. Dr. Robert Seelig was the project historian, and through his well-documented analysis, he was able to identify nearly 50 African-American soldiers and Native Americans who fought there. And today, battlefield tours, new historical signage, educational programs, and social media posts are all reaching out to new audiences and providing that information. I'm going to stick at Red Bank for a moment and talk about this button that you see this links my archaeological work into some of the things. And I would say that all of these are projects that I'm directly involved in, so I'm kind of linking these through my own personal experience, but through places I've been. Among the new stories being explored at Red Bank is the role of other African-American troops at the fort. Archaeology sometimes forces us to re-examine what we think we know, and our work at Fort Mercer is a case in point. In the summer of 2023, during a public archaeology day, a small hearth feature, which you see shown here, was discovered. The hearth consisted of fire-reddened earth, fire-cracked rocks, food bone, musket balls, bits of glass, a glass bead, and the remnants of a marked regimental coat button. The feature is clearly related to the battle, the period of 1777. But the marked regimental coat button is not of the 1st or 2nd Rhode Island. The button has the mark of a number 4, which you can see it in the upper right corner. I think you can all see that 4. The metal is pewter, and the button is in extremely poor condition. The incised 4 likely represents soldiers of the Connecticut regiments. Like the Rhode Island formations, many of the Connecticut regiments had African-American soldiers in their ranks. And for several weeks, elements of the 4th and 8th Connecticut served at the garrison at Fort Mercer and at Fort Mifflin across the river. So my sense is that button is related to the 4th Connecticut, which provides more support to African-American soldiers fighting at their rank. 2 independent infantry companies were attached to the 4th Connecticut and had been there since early in the year. These 2 companies hailed from Westmoreland County, and an area that at that time was in the Wyoming Valley of what is today the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, but at that time was considered to be part of Connecticut. One of the soldiers in that Westmoreland company, commanded by Robert Durkee, was an African-American named Gershom Prince. While we don't know for certain, it seems highly likely that Gershom was part of the garrison at Red Bank in November of 1777. His company had been sent from the valley to reinforce Washington's army, and by the end of 1777, that company was desperately needed back in the Wyoming Valley to defend it against Crown forces' incursions and raids. Gershom Prince was killed in July of 1778 at the Battle of Wyoming. His powder horn, which you see here, was recovered from the battlefield. The powder horn was passed down by his descendants until into the 20th century. It was finally donated to the Wyoming County Historical, to what is today the Luzerne County Historical Society. Gershom Prince's powder horn is unique, not only because he was an African American in the Revolution, but also because he clearly carved words on the horn, essentially leaving his signature for posterity. What you see carved there, it says, Gershom Prince, his horn, made at Crown Point, September the 3rd, 1761. Prince, Negro, his horn. He also carved a warning, steal not this horn. The carving on the horn is dated 1761, and it depicts Crown Point, New York. This indicates that Gershom was serving with the Connecticut soldiers in the 7 Years' War, 14 or 17 years earlier than the American Revolution. One footnote describes him as a servant or slave, so we're not sure what his role was, whether he was a free man or enslaved person, to Robert Durkee. But there's no evidence of this either way. Gershom's horn attests to his life and his humanity. The quest for freedom was particularly meaningful for African Americans, and for Gershom, he gave his last full measure of devotion to this. The powder horn reminds us that his life mattered. I'm going to try to finish my presentation tonight. I'm going to go back, I think. I'll start with this. With a story that links us to Red Bank, the Wyoming Valley, and today's Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. Before it was presented to the Luzerne County Historical Society, that Gershom Prince powder horn descended through the Dennis family of northeastern Pennsylvania. The Dennis family is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, documented free African American families in the region, dating back to the late 18th century. The farm was originally settled by Prince Perkins, a free African American Revolutionary War veteran, and he moved in that area in 1793. And the property has remained in the same family in their descendants for, I think we're at generation 8 or 9, for over 200 years. The Dennis farm is a rare example of longevity for an African American farmstead. The farm provides an understanding about free African American settlement and the way of life in an integrated rural Pennsylvania community, and attests to the strong anti-slavery sentiments in antebellum northeastern Pennsylvania. Today, it's operated by the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust, and they maintain a 150-plus acre farm in Susquehanna County, which has been in their family for those 200 years. The ancestors of that family included Prince Perkins and Bristol Bud Sampson, both veterans of the Revolution from Connecticut, just like Gershom Prince. Prince Perkins and Bristol Bud were likely born into slavery, but their military service, documented in their pensions and in the muster rolls, shows that both men served throughout the war and fought at places like Saratoga, White Marsh, and Stony Point. After the war, they moved their families to the lands that are today in northeastern Pennsylvania, but at that time were in dispute between the Yankees of Connecticut and the settlers of Pennsylvania. A digression, if you've ever heard of the Yankee-Pennamite Wars, that's the war. That's where they occurred, right up in that section of Pennsylvania, Susquehanna County. We were fighting with Connecticut. Today, the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust is the stewards of the land that 8 generations of a free black family farmed. Their legacy is now a unique place in Pennsylvania and in that region. The site is now listed to the National Register of Historic Places. The family burial ground at the farm marks the resting place of Bristol Bud, Prince Perkins, and several black Civil War veterans. This is a family and a farm that are recorded in the 19th century antiquarian histories of Susquehanna County, but that only now are becoming more widely known. Last summer, June of 2023, the Dennis Farm welcomed 200 elected officials and invited guests to celebrate the dedication ceremony and unveiling of America 250 PA's Dennis Farm semi-quincentennial bell. This is the first of several bells that the America 250 PA will present to historically significant sites in Pennsylvania to commemorate our nation's 250th birthday. The caption engraved on the bell was written by the Dennis Farm Charitable Land Trust founder and CEO, Denise Dennis. And it says, quote, "When the nation was young, our free African American ancestors owned and farmed this beautiful place against great odds. If you are ever in the vicinity of Montrose, Pennsylvania, on your way up Route 81, I think that is, heading into New York, you can come right past the Dennis Farm. It's open, it's a site that's available for people to come see. That can be seen on site." I'll conclude. American history is complex and layered. We catch glimpses, as through a glass darkly, of these people that I've talked about. Sam, Benjamin Harris Martin, the Rhode Island men of color at Red Bank, Gershom Prince, the Perkinses, and the Dennis families. We can't know at this distance what were the motivations of these people. Sam and the other enslaved people at the Cooch Farm remained in bondage throughout the war years. Their stories are perhaps the least well documented of what I've talked about. For Benjamin Harris Martin and his family, his day of jubilee may have been the day in 1807 that Alexander Martin's will was read. That legal document established Benjamin as a landowner and a free man. Military service ensured Bristol Bud Sampson and Prince Perkins. They and their descendants became landowners and free men in northeastern Pennsylvania. And Gershom Prince, who fought for American liberty, never knew how that war turned out, having lost his life at the Battle of Wyoming. I've attempted to bring you on a historical journey that links places and people. I find it remarkable, perhaps coincidental, that Sam may have known Benjamin Harris Martin at Cooch's Bridge. It's entirely likely they passed each other at those places. That Gershom Prince was at Red Bank, along with those Rhode Island soldiers that fought there. And that his descendants, Gershom Prince's descendants, curated his powder horn, which turns out to be the Dennis and Perkins family that are still living and still linked to northeastern Pennsylvania. These connected stories span space and time and give us a glimpse at the range of black experience during the American Revolution. We have seen enslaved persons, soldiers, and activists. And their actions and their roles during the war year were very much defined and circumscribed by the color of their skin. The stories I presented are based on documentary sources, oral traditions, and family records. These are not stories that so much have been suppressed, but need to be amplified and element. And they are all still part of the story of American history. Thank you.
Thank you, Wade. Next, we have a speaker that we always look forward to seeing. Once a year, he comes to visit, and he lets us know about what's going on at our very, very famous school that Shirley Bueller went to. His name is Sonny Knox, and I see he's with someone else, Professor David Wilkes. Is that you I see up there? Yeah, come on up and tell us a little bit about what's happening. And after we see them, we'll have Scott Palmer will come up and he'll do his lecture. Thank you.
Good evening. Sorry. I didn't know I was supposed to say anything tonight, but it was always a great opportunity to talk about the 107. See, I tell people all the time, when you talk about the little school down the road about a half a mile, don't ever forget that C, because I was told there's a school down over somewhere that was 107. For the white kids. The 107C was for the colored kids. I started my career at the 107C in 1937, after my family moved from Maryland up here. I started off in the 7th grade. I mean, in the 2nd grade. See, I'm talking a lot already. In the 2nd grade. It was a one-room school with 6 grades and 1 teacher. Now, people have often asked me, how did one teacher handle about 25 kids? Well, you see, it was a lot of discipline back during that day. Not only was it the teacher was strong, but our parents were strong. Nowadays, the parents go to the school and they meet with the teacher and they sometimes have an argument with the teacher. But my mother, the teacher was right. And when my mother came to school, the last thing I wanted for her to come to school, because if Mom walked through that door, I would say, Lord, if you want me to live, you will paralyze my mother before she gets through there. But it was a great school. Like I said, with 6 rows of seats, each row was a grade. And nowadays, I volunteer at Del Castle and kids have all kinds of stuff, electronic stuff that they do, phones and iPads and so forth. All we had was a wall covered with blackboards, and we read from the book. Teacher may give you an assignment to read 2 pages, maybe page 2 and 3. Well, you would stand up and you would read page 2. When you turn to page 3, it might not be there. Because you see, we never got new books. We got the old books from the white school up on the hill. So at the time we got it, back in that day, you put your name in the back of the book. And it'd be 4 or 5 names back there with the kids that we played with every day. In and out each other's houses. Probably licked off each other's ice cream, we don't know. But that's where kids were. But we never went to school together because of segregation. I could stay up here and talk to you half the night about the 107C. But I know the time schedule is going. But I will tell you, if you get the opportunity, please come down and visit the 107C. And we're sitting back there, there's a lot of history in that school about old Hockessin, where the families were in love with each other, where our schools were strict. You learned what the teacher told you. Whatever it was, you learned it before you left out of there if you wanted to live. God bless you.
Happy Juneteenth, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Darlene, I had no idea, so I got all dressed for the occasion. But I'm David Wilk, and one of the greatest gifts in my life, besides my family, children, and grandchildren, is 107C. And the reason is I have the blessing and the gift of getting to work and know and become friends with our national treasures here in Hockessin. And you just heard Mr. Sonny Knott, who is a national treasure and living history. There's no research, it's primary. He lived during the time when blacks and whites couldn't go to the same school together, and also when the school at 4266 Mill Creek Road had 30 students for almost 40 years, from 1920 until 1959, when it closed. And I'd also like to introduce some of the other national treasures. Nancy, don't hide. Nancy Johnson, who's also one of the students that went to the Nancy, did I get it right? 46 or 48? 48, okay? 1948. And then next to Nancy is Mr. Charlie Johnson. And Charlie was 46. Am I correct on that, Charlie? Okay. So imagine they were here down the street going to school before young Shirley Beulah came into the picture in 1950 and became the center of the Beulah v. Gephardt case that became one of the 5 cases in the Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Board of Education, that from a history standpoint, most people in Delaware still don't know the significance of that in our nation's history and the role that Hockessin played, and Claymont and Howard High School in the desegregation of schools. And just some great facts to go with that. The Brown v. Board of Education decision was rendered on May 17th of 1954. In 1952, Chancellor Colin Seitz ordered the immediate desegregation of public schools in Delaware 2 years before Brown. So most people don't know that Delaware was also the first state to desegregate public schools in our country. And that's good. And this all happened right here, around the corner. And the Historical Society has done such a wonderful job with Darlene and Pete and all the members of supporting everything that we've been doing over the last 12 years to take a damaged historic structure and turn it into a center for diversity, inclusion, and social equity, and not just a center. A county park. Councilwoman Janet Kilpatrick is back there. Janet was a huge catalyst and our friend and supporter from day one for our mission. And also we had, did I see Senator Sokola? Is he still here? Dave Sokola? He might have left. Okay. And anyway, I also saw Dr. Ray Blackwell. Dr. Blackwell, can you come up for a minute, please?
I'm really underdressed.
I can't help it. Dr. Ray Blackwell who is Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Christiana Care and the Chair of the Friends of Hockessin Color School number 107C. And we're just so grateful to be a part of this community and to be a catalyst. So in addition to being a county park, we're also a national park now. National Park Service under Brown v. Board of Education. So we're very excited to celebrate with you. Thank you for the surprise introduction. Let me just welcome Dr. Blackwell. And most importantly, Our website is HockessinColoredSchool107.org, which is in the program. And we would like to welcome you all to come by and see what we've created to memorialize the story of Beulah, the story of all the students. Every single student that went to the school has their picture and name on a plaque in our community room. To never forget one person, to not try and suppress history of what happened, but to honor it and to advance and expand. So, thank you very much.
So happy Juneteenth, and I am really underdressed. I did not anticipate coming up front. I have the pleasure and blessing of being associated with 107C and the national treasures that David just spoke about. I'm not from Delaware, but I think we should be proud of what happened here in Delaware. On May 17, 1954, a Supreme Court decision changed the face of America. And it was based on a decision that came out of Delaware. And part of our mission is to change America again. A lot of the things that we faced then, we face now. We just have the courage to do the right thing. And hopefully 107C will have a voice in that change. I welcome you to come by and see what we're doing to help us out. There's a lot of history there. And there's a lot of love. So everyone is welcome to come by. I thank you for your time.
Next we have Scott Palmer, and he's going to come up and he's going to introduce himself a little bit. I think you will enjoy it. Scott?
My name is Scott Palmer. I'm a local historian. I write a site called the Elk Creek Country History Blog. I'm just not a professional. I just enjoy history, as I'm sure you do, and enjoy finding these little stories here and there. And tonight, I want to talk to you about a local resident here, Hockessin's Jacob Heald. Now, from its very beginnings, Hockessin was primarily a Quaker town. Many of the earliest European settlers in the area were members of the Society of Friends. And the very name Hockessin, it likely, in my opinion, and we'll get more to this in a moment, came from the name of the home of one of the Quaker farmers, and whose home the society met. Their meetings even before the first meeting house was built here. Generally speaking, the Quakers tended to be pretty socially conscious and putting a lot of importance on things like freedom, equality, and education. But even within socially conscious groups, there can be different ways to go about it depending on one's personality. I'm sure there were a lot of friends that quietly in the background worked to make their society more equitable. But just as every group needs people like that, you also need folks who are more outspoken and more willing to put themselves out there to fight for what they think is right. And Hockessin's Jacob Heald was one of those guys. Jacob was born in nearby Pennsbury Township, PA, just this side of Chas Ford, on September 13, 1800, to Quakers Joseph and Hannah Mendenhall Heald. And when Jacob was just a young boy in 1805, the family moved to Hockessin to a stone house that still stands out on Bench Road. And he attended the district school here in Hockessin, which at the time was out by the Friends Meeting House. It was there until the new school was built in 1870. It's now the Lambourne Library. And Jacob worked on the family farm. In 1819, he set out on a big adventure with Henry Heald, his second cousin once removed, if I did my math right, and Jeshua H. Dixon, who grew up down the road on Valley Road and later on a farm on Southwood Road. They set out on the National Road, which ran from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, Virginia, now West Virginia. They went out with the hopes of securing government contracts for surveying work out there. Unfortunately, they made it a little bit too late for that. They missed out on that. But the group continued on west through Indiana into Illinois, at a time when that was pretty much the western frontier. On the way home, they swung south through Kentucky, Virginia, and Maryland. When they got home, Jacob transitioned from farming to teaching. And he first worked at the Hockessin school. Then after a time, he returned to school himself. He went to the Friends boarding school in Westtown. He studied math there, and apparently, and fittingly for this year, apparently calculated several lunar and solar eclipses. When he was done there, Jacob taught for a year at the Eden School, which is now lost school. It was out on Little Baltimore Road, out near the end of Doe Run Road. And then for a time, he came back to home after his father passed away and helped his widowed mother run the farm. After about a year of that, he returned to Westtown Boarding School, this time as a teacher. He stayed there for about a year and a half. In 1826, Jacob married Sarah Wilson, who grew up on her father, Stephen Wilson's farm, and another house that's still standing down in the area that's now Hockessin Valley Falls. In the first few years of their marriage, they lived up on a farm Jacob bought near Kennett Square. But then on April 23rd, 1830, he'll purchase a 229-acre farm on the northeast side of Old Wilmington Road from the heirs of William Wilkinson, and a farm that had previously been owned by William Phillips. Now, I remember the house I mentioned at the beginning that was the beginning of the name of the area. Well, this was the house that Jacob Heald had purchased. Now, Jacob and his growing family, eventually 5 children, would live there for the next 26 years. But if I can take a quick digression here and talk for a moment about the name Hockessin. It's admittedly kind of an unusual name. And I always remember watching the Philadelphia news broadcast whenever there was a story here. You just wait to see how they're going to pronounce it. It usually came out something like Hockessin. But over the years, the real mystery, though, isn't really the pronunciation of the name, it's the origin. But we'll hold on to the pronunciation idea for a moment. Over the years, the usual explanation was it was some kind of Indian name. And since it doesn't really sound or look like anything else in English, it's natural to look to another language to try to find where the name came from. And I don't know where the idea that it was a Lenape name came from, but by 1888, historian J. Thomas Scharf was relaying one of the most common stories about it. In his History of Delaware, he wrote, quote, that Hockessin is an Indian word said to mean good bark, and was so called on account of the excellent quality of white oak found in this locality. But then again, 2 paragraphs later, he writes that it's, quote, an aboriginal name of uncertain derivation, but said by some to mean good bark hill. Now, it seems like he's hedging a little bit on the second one there, but still pretty sure that it was of native origin. One explanation for that is the little bit of contradiction there is that his work was sort of a compilation of work done by other researchers on him, so it's probably 2 different people that wrote those 2 different paragraphs. But another explanation that came about was that it meant a place of many foxes. And the thing is that both of those seem kind of plausible. As it turns out, the local native word for bark was something like hocus, H-O-K-E-S in English. And the word for fox was like hocus, H-O-C-K-U-S. So they sound like they could be right, but obviously they both can't be right. And I don't think that either of them is. I think that this is more a situation of people deciding that it was an Indian name and then working backwards to try to find an explanation for it. And local historian and writer C.A. Westlager also thought so. And in 1964, he wrote an article for Names, the Journal of the American Name Society, which apparently was a thing. And in it, he laid out another theory, and one that I personally think is probably more likely to be correct. But to be clear, as far as I know, none of this is really settled for sure. It all comes back to that house that Jacob Heel bought in 1830. See, I told you this was all connected. We don't need to go through the whole history of the house, although I know there's people here who know it. But the quote, the short version of it is that the original section of the house was built in 1726 by Quakers William and Catherine Cox. And from 1730 until the first meeting house was built in 1737, the Friends, the Quakers, met in the front parlor of William Cox's house. And then in 1737, on land donated by William Cox, there was a meeting house built. But what does all this have to do with Hockessin? Well, like many farmers then and now, Cox had a name for his farm. And it shows up in many documents and many different variations. But then again, I like to say that at the time, spelling, especially of names, was really more of an art than a science. And the earliest instance that I know of was in 1734 in a deed where he was referred to as William Cox of here, and in that one it was spelling used was O-C-A-S-S-O-N. Over the years there's been probably a dozen or more different variations of the spelling. O-C-C-A-S-I-O-N, O-C-K, O-K-E-S-S-I-O-N. There have been a lot of different variations. The point is that they're all obviously trying to refer to the same word. The problem is the same one that we started with. How is it pronounced? Because it doesn't really look like an English word. So the funny thing is, I started out by kind of making fun of the Philadelphia newscasters for pronouncing the name wrong. But it turns out that I think most of us have been pronouncing it wrong also. But to be fair, to be clear, they weren't right either. The clue comes from an old story that was told to Westlager by Catherine Ball, who was the widow of Dr. and Senator Lewis Heisler Ball. And she had told him that older residents claimed that Hockessin Road, which is now Old Wilmington Road, got its name when an old Quaker saw a young couple in a carriage, stumbled together with her head on his shoulder. The old Quaker looked at them and said, "Oh, kissin'." I think obviously this is kind of a faux etymology, just the story to kind of go back and explain something after the fact. It's not really very helpful, I think, in trying to find the origin of the word, but I think it does help with the pronunciation. I think in the same way that you would say Hockessin and not Hockessin, Hockessin used to be pronounced with the accent on the second syllable. And I think if you find people that grew up in the area before, say, about the 1950s, they're likely to pronounce it as Hockessin. And it was really with the influx of kind of post-war suburbanites and people that came in that it became more of Hockessin, as we're familiar with now. And that finally pivots us back to the original name. With all the different spellings and lots of ways that it could have been pronounced, but if you stick with Hockessin, Westlager gives us what I think is a pretty plausible theory as to what the original name of William Cox's farm was. And he says it was originally occasion, like a special event or happening. And then over time, occasion became Hockessin, and then to Hockessin. And again, none of this is settled case law at this point, but until someone can show me the use of the word for William Cox, or a mention of it being a Lenape or Native American name before the late 1800s, that's the theory that I'm going to go with. But we'll get back to Jacob Heel, and he's now living at Occasion. And during that time, he would become an active and integral and outspoken member of the Hockessin community and beyond. And there were a number of different issues and causes that Jacob and Sarah became active in. One was education, which is not surprising for a Quaker. After Delaware passed the Free School Act in 1829, the state was divided up into small school districts, each with one school, very often a one-room schoolhouse. And the local residents were tasked with hiring a teacher, electing a school board, which is usually about 3 people, and raising the tax revenue for the school. And in addition to often housing the teacher for District 29, which is what Hockessin was, Jacob Peel also was apparently pretty good at getting these referendums passed. In order to raise taxes, they had to pass a referendum, much like the school districts have to today. And Jacob Peel apparently was pretty good at that and kept Hockessin as one of the better schools in the area. And even after the Heels eventually moved to Wilmington in 1856, Jacob remained involved with the schools in the city as well. Another cause that the Heels were involved with was the temperance movement. And again, this is in line with our Quaker beliefs. There's a reason why the Society of Friends are known for many things, but hosting raging parties is not one of them. It was customary at the time for farmers to either supply whiskey to their farm hands, or at least to tolerate its use in the field. But Jacob Peel put an end to that on his farm, which I'm sure went over really well with the work, with the help. But that brings us here. We're here today, on this day, and we've been talking about a guy who's involved in a bunch of socially progressive 19th century causes, and it obviously prompts the question, was he an abolitionist? And the answer is definitely yes, but it also brings to light some of the difficulties in researching abolitionists, and especially Underground Railroad activity. Now, while I have no doubt that many or even most in the Quaker community harbored anti-slavery sentiments, we do know that Jacob Peel was actively involved in the abolitionist cause. Now, how active? How about go all the way to Buffalo in 1848 active? Because in August of that year, he attended the National Free Soil Convention in the Queen City, which nominated former President Martin Van Buren as the Free Soil Party's presidential nominee. Among some of the other notable attendees to that convention were Walt Whitman and Frederick Douglass. Now, I'll forgive you if you don't remember the Free Soil Party from history class. They were a short-lived coalition party that was actually formed that year and would then merge into the new Republican Party in 1854. And they had sort of staked out sort of a halfway position on slavery, somewhere between the mainstream Democrats and Whigs, who either were pro-slavery or tolerated it on one hand, and the abolitionist Liberty Party on the other hand, which wanted slavery done with altogether. The Free Soil Party's main cause was in preventing the further spread of slavery, especially into the new states and territory that were acquired from Mexico during the Mexican-American War. The Free Soil Party held that the federal government had no right to overrule state laws on slavery, but that they should halt its further expansion. I personally feel that Jacob Peel's involvement with the Free Soil Party probably had less to do with it being exactly in line with his own beliefs, and probably more to do with pragmatism. At this point, the country really wasn't ready for abolitionists to have widespread electoral success. But the Free Soilers, I don't really know if that's what they call themselves, but they could have some success, and they did. And while Van Buren did not win the presidential election that year, of course, he did get about 10% of the vote, which was the highest total at that point for a third-party candidate. They did elect about a dozen congressmen and one senator that year. And the senator, incidentally, was Salmon P. Chase, who later became governor of Ohio, would be one of the chief financiers of the Civil War as the Treasury Secretary under Lincoln, and then would leave that job to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But as far as research goes, those are kind of the easier things to do. It's easy to tell when someone like Jacob Heald is involved with a group like that. It's much more difficult to determine or find evidence of covert activities like Underground Railroad activity. And for Heald in particular, most of what's known, or at least what I know of him, comes from a fantastically long and detailed and glowing obituary that was printed in the paper after his death in January of 1887. Now, frankly, I could have just stood up here and read that whole obituary, and you would know pretty much everything you need to know about the life and times of Jacob Heald. But in addition to everything else, it does state that his home was a station on the Underground Railroad, and that, quote, many fugitives were fed thereat and helped by him on to liberty. Now, the home in question, of course, would be Occasion, also now known as the Cox Phillips Mitchell House. There really is no other evidence, at least that I know of, for or against any kind of Underground Railroad activity at the property. And therein lies the problem. There almost never is. Finding evidence of it is tough. I mean, first of all, keep in mind that while we hold the whole thing in high regard, it was at the time an illegal act, and therefore inherently covert. You didn't go bragging about how and when and where you were going to commit illegal acts. It would have been very harmful to the activity. And it also, I think, would have been very much out of character for most of the people involved. Most people involved in the Underground Railroad and doing that weren't the type of people that would go around and saying, oh, look what I'm doing, I'm so great, I'm doing all this, look at me. And certainly during the time of the activity, even afterwards. And sometimes the best that we can hope for is that sometime after the fact, someone else documents what was going on and what they did. And that's what we have here with Jacob Heald's obituary. If indeed the Healds did allow their home to be used as an Underground Railroad station, I think it's probably more likely that home might have meant the farm in general, not the house. It wasn't a B&B. It was a way station for desperate people. And for all the reasons I mentioned, information about Underground Railroad activity is always hard to come by, and I think should be looked at kind of skeptically. It's kind of sort of the new Washington slept here. Everybody wants to be involved with it and connected to it. A lot of old houses have weird little nooks and cupboards and little rooms and things in the root cellar and little places that people look at and say, that's big enough to fit a person in, and automatically think that it's connected to the Underground Railroad. And now, sometimes it is. There have been documented situations where that has been the case, but it's not always the case. But the more I went back and read that obituary for Jacob Heald, the more it sounded to me like the person that was writing it knew what they were talking about. And there's one big clue that I saw in it that makes me think this. And the first thing you need to know is exactly where the Heald house and farm were and are. The house and the barn are still standing in beautiful condition up there on Old Wilmington Road. But more specifically, the barn is almost exactly a half a mile from the PA-Delaware state line. And I know that this has led some people to question whether the farm really was a station on the Underground Railroad. And that does kind of make sense. I mean, if you've walked hundreds of miles in the dark through forests and swamps and over rivers and streams, the whole time looking over your shoulder wondering if somebody's going to grab you and take you back to unspeakable things, why would you stop here? Why wouldn't you walk just a few more minutes, really, to get into Pennsylvania, into at least a little bit more safety of Pennsylvania? And it does kind of make sense. And if we think about Underground railroad stations and stops, we sometimes naturally think, at least I do, of somebody hiding out overnight, or actually probably more likely during the day, resting and waiting to carry on their journey north. But that's not what the Heald obituary said. It didn't say he housed any escaping enslaved people. It said, say again, many fugitives were fed thereat and helped by him on to liberty. And that kind of makes more sense to me. It sounds more likely to me that whoever wrote that knew what they were talking about, and that it's more likely that the fleeing slaves could stop there, get something to eat, I don't know, maybe a little bit of medical care, and then directions on to where to go next in their journey north. And for somebody like Heald, who is obviously connected into a lot of different people and organizations, and did a lot of what we would probably call networking today, it makes sense that he would know the next place to go and be able to point people on to the next stop. And I think that's probably how the farm was used. That's my opinion. But in 1856, the 56-year-old Heald sold the farm to Howard E. Flynn and moved to Wilmington. And I'm 52, I don't blame him for wanting to get out of farming. In Wilmington, he moved to Wilmington that, I should mention, his family helped to shape. The biggest example would have been his brother, Joshua T. Heald, who, of course, also is from Hockessin. Joshua suffered an injury as a boy and couldn't go into farming. He began his career as a bookkeeper, eventually became a bookseller and bookbinder. But in the 1850s, turned his attention to real estate and transportation. And really, Joshua T. Heald could be a whole other talk to himself, but the short version of his story is that he was largely responsible for the first trolley line in Wilmington, which was originally a horse-drawn trolley line, later electrified, which ran westward out Delaware Avenue, out to where he put the trolley barn, out that way in the area that's still known as Trolley Square. And not at all coincidentally, Joshua also bought 40 acres of land out that way, where the trolley line happened to run. And he developed what was farmland into sort of a trolley suburb, even though it was still technically within the city limits. And that neighborhood is still known as 40 acres today. And all the beautiful homes, the late 19th, early 20th century homes that you see lining Delaware Avenue were really there because of Joshua T. Heald's work, including his own home that he built along there. Right before his death in 1887, Heald began the development of the first real trolley line, the real trolley suburb of Wilmington, which became Ellesmere, although it wouldn't really take off for another 10 years or so when the first trolley line was built out that direction. And also Joshua T. Heald also happened to be the chief financier and the first president of the Wilmington Western Railroad. But when Jacob Heald died in January of 1887, it was at the Wilmington home of his son, Dr. Pusey Heald, who was a leading physician in Wilmington. And in 1871, he had opened Heald's Hygiene home at his home at Shallcross and Van Buren Streets. He sold it in 1888, a year after his father's death, and it became the Homeopathic Hospital, later on Memorial Hospital, and after that Memorial Division. And in case you get the old hospitals mixed up, because there were several of them, there's also the Physicians and Surgeons Hospital, that became Wilmington General. The Memorial Division was the one down by 95 and Brandywine River, and where the high-rise condos are now. So while Jacob Heald's brother and son helped build the city, Jacob himself had done what he could to mold society in general into a more equitable and fair and moral shape. Someday I hope that we can learn more about Jacob Heald, but what we know now, I think the man makes a pretty interesting story. Thank you.
while you're still here. No?
Hey, just one real quick. So the name Carrie, from the first presenter, I think, is that any relation to the name Carrie we hear now, or is there none? Do we know?
Carrie,
Harmon Carrie?
Harmon Carrie, no, it's a different spelling.
C-A-R-Y, right?
Carrie, Harmon Carrie has an E,
Oh, okay, okay.
E-Y. Yeah, no relation.
Any other questions? For any other guest speakers? Any questions for us regarding the Historical Society? How many members do we have here? It's $15 a person, it's $45 for a family membership. Please become a member. It really helps us out and gives us a pool of volunteers. So then we'll just bother you and invite you to free events and things like that. So we do have 3 buildings that we're responsible for. 2 are over at the park right outside of Hockessin, Tweets Tavern, and we have a museum behind that. There's no sign, so you wouldn't know what the buildings are yet. But we hope to be more open to the public in the future. And then Lambourne Library is also our responsibility to maintain. And old buildings require a lot of maintenance, a lot of upkeep, and there's always things happening with them that need attention.
I just wanted to ask.
Sure.
When is the Hockessin
I think that's mostly by appointment. They, does anybody know that's with the community center?
Question?
Are you open by appointment? When is the community center open?
We don't have a staff there, but we will meet with you. You give us a call on something and let you in to tour the building.
And I think they should have a link to an email on the 107.
Yes.
So if you look on the back of your program, the third from the bottom, there's a website there, and that'll forward you to their site.
So what name do you go by now? Junior Center or the Hockessin Public School 107?
It's Hockessin 107C, and I'm pretty sure that's pretty much what they go by.
So it's not.
Not the community center, no.
David's name will show up, and they will contact somebody who can let you in, who can meet you, and let you in and tour the building.
They have a really great museum set up. It's fairly small, but it's very, very nice. And the idea is mostly to have it set up for groups to come by and have diversity and equity training, I guess, more than just a museum. So
Okay.
it's going to be set up for school groups, I think, and work settings also. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you for attending, and we hope to do this program every year, and we hope to expand and have other programs. And if you'd like to see our buildings, let us know, send us an email, and we can always open up the buildings and give you a site. Thank you. And you don't realize how many hours are put into making this program. Darlene Amobi spends lots and lots of time setting these programs up. So special thanks to Darlene.